Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR tutorial series, where you learn by watching other VR, AR, and MR professionals create the magic. I'm Marcelo Lewin, an immersive content specialist focused on e-learning and training. I'm also the creator and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest creator today is Marianna Vallejo, the founder of Daily Magic Productions, the creator of the VR game Witching Tower VR. Today, Marianna will be showing us how to create an initial concept for your VR game. But before we get started, I want to remind you to register at howtocreatevr.com. It's free, and registration gives you access to all our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more. Just visit howtocreatevr.com and click on the Register for Free button. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltspaceVR and subscribe to our channel. All right, Marianna, welcome to the tutorial series.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. We actually did a podcast together also on creating a concept for your VR game, right?
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah.
My team was also very excited to see that podcast.
Yep.
Go live.
Definitely. It's going to go live pretty soon. I'm glad you were able to jump in and do a presentation for us on actually giving tips and tricks on creating the concept of a game, specifically in VR. But before we do that, I'd love to ask questions of my presenters so people get to know them. So maybe we can get into why you got into VR creation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So my company, Daily Magic, we specialize in creating adventure games in any form. And we've been doing that since 2010. We built about 25 puzzle adventure games for PC. And when VR started taking off a couple of years ago, we saw a great opportunity to transition our experience in adventure gaming into VR. And that's how we came up with Witching Tower.
But what attracted you to VR personally?
Personally, I was fascinated how immersive it is and that I can physically be inside the game, and the things that I will be doing in the game, they feel as realistic as in real life.
I agree with you 100%. So do you feel like in the future, ultimately, I'm talking about maybe 5-10 years from now, that you will completely be doing VR gaming? Or do you think there's always going to be room for the, I guess, quote unquote, traditional flat gaming?
Right now, we're looking into VR gaming and mobile. So VR attracts us because it's like endless opportunities for creating beautiful environments and mysteries and all this, immersive storytelling. And mobile, it attracts us because it's so accessible and everybody has a phone. And it's still very interesting to make like massive mainstream games.
Sure, definitely. Well, let's wait until the phone and the AR glasses and the VR goggles all merge into one and see what happens.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. If you had the control and power, what would the ultimate VR experience look like to you? It doesn't have to be a game. It could be any kind of experience. But what is the ultimate experience in VR? So
for me, I think it will be like highly interactive, very high resolution mystery game / experience where you can walk around environments that you can never do in real life, and they'll be like scaring you a little bit, but not too much, like no jump scares, and with some mild combat. And the closest reference to that is Silent Hill. So essentially my ultimate VR dream is Silent Hill in VR, but like with all this new graphic power we have now.
Yeah, that sounds like a really cool experience. One experience that I do love that kind of gets to that point, but there is no combat is Transference. It's a very scary kind of experience. Really good graphics, and actually it's borderline creepy, where you have to sometimes take your HMD out because it gets a little bit too creepy. But I don't know if you've tried that experience, but it's a pretty cool experience.
Yeah, I actually tried Transference one time at Oculus Connect. It's very good storytelling.
Yeah.
And yes, it's a little too creepy, and
right.
I did a part where you're in some kind of house,
right?
And I mean that house is cool, but it can be something like crazy castle or like large Victorian house that is like more fantastic looking.
Sure.
But anyway, that game's great. I got freaked out when I saw somebody shot in the face. I was like, whoa, that's too much.
I didn't get that far. You gave some spoilers away, but that's okay. All right, Marianna, I'm going to go ahead and let you get started on the tutorial. And if I have any questions, I'll jump right in.
Great. Let's get to it.
All right. Before we get into the details about the game concept and how to create a vision for your VR game, we need to know who are you creating this concept for? Who are you going to show it and why are you doing this? And essentially, you doing it for yourself because you need on a very high level understand what are you trying to do and how it's going to look and feel. And second, you doing it for your team because this would be the first people you need to sell this concept and vision to, because if you can't get anybody excited to make your game, then it's just not going to work. And when you're showing this initial concept to your team, they're going to be adding things and essentially it will transform into some common concept and vision. But as a designer or project manager or just a visionary of the project, you need to start with something. Also, later it will transform into the pitch deck, the real pitch deck that you'll be showing around to publishers, to distributors, licensors, to people that you will be meeting at conventions or meetups or whatever. And our studio, we send the concept deck to literally anybody who's asking about the game because they need to know right away what's it about. And it's to be short, simple, and understandable for even non-gamers.
Quick question for you, Marianna. Do you need to customize the deck depending if it's for your team or for, let's say, licensors or even investors, if you're looking for investors? Do you need to customize it and change it up, or having the same deck for all these audience members is okay?
So what I'm going to be talking about, this is mostly like internal deck. So this for yourself and your team, but for publishers and anybody from outside of the company, it needs to be way fancier with like concept art, some kind of budget, and everything that you'll explain for your team, it needs to be in a fancier language. And instead of saying the features of the game is sword and shield, hitting somebody with a hammer, you need to say like you are fighting for your life in dystopian future by using your weapon that left from the spaceship or something like that.
Right. No, that makes total sense. Perfect. Thank you.
So now we know who we're doing this for. Let's move on to the vision of the game and how to come up with that. So let's start with figuring out the initial vision of the game and elaborating the basics of what will be the foundation of your game. What you need to ask yourself about and document it is what is unique about this game in VR. Right now, and maybe for next couple of years, the entrance to VR is still, the barrier is pretty high, and the game needs to be unique enough to players to make an effort and play it in VR. And it can be some mechanic or some breathtaking visuals or something, or just some existing mechanic, but it's way more fun to play in VR. You need to right away think about what the story is about. It can be very, very short tagline that the game is about shooting zombies or helping out teddy bears in the forest or something like that. Gameplay features need to be elaborated, and even in a very simple game, you end up with a lot of features, but you need to think what the player will be doing most of his or her time. So what the player will be doing 50% of the time in the game. You need to think about your target audience, but not in the sense of age, gender, or whatever. In VR, it's slightly different because you, like, pretty much everybody is your audience, but you need to think who will be most excited about this. What kind of players, which games they already play, that when they see your banner, they'll be super excited. What games they will compare it to, because that's also important. That's how subconscious mind of players work. And if they see something that is kind of similar that they like, they're going to jump into it. And we've been, with Witching Tower, we've been doing some experiments with that. And our main reference for that game was Elder Scrolls Skyrim. And whenever we run public playtest, we will ask that question, like which is the closest reference to the game. And if we get like at least 5 out of 10 people say Skyrim, it means like we're on the right track. And initially, you need to be very clear on how much time do you have to make that game, because it will determine the amount of content and amount of features and amount of anything that goes in the game. And for VR specifically, that can't be too long. And I suggest just make a shorter game, but that will take you like 6-8 months tops. And the screenshot on the right is for VR zombie shooter Arizona Sunshine. And essentially what their basic foundation vision is that VR meets zombie apocalypse, and it's a zombie shooter built exclusively for VR. And they right away mentioned the setting, which is Southwestern America, all run by zombies. So this is a pretty good example of like initial vision that kind of covers a lot of ground. I, as designer and project manager, and a lot of designers in our company, would like to start creating a vision with look and feel and a story, and then move on to the features and the gameplay. A lot of other developers do it differently, but that's how we do it. And first, we determine the genre and setting and how to come up with that. So genre does not exist in like pure form anymore. It's usually something combined: puzzle adventure, action adventure, exploration plus shooter or something like that. So you don't need to worry too much about clear definition, but you need to define the core. And the setting is basically the look and feel. It doesn't need to be like historically accurate, but you just need to imagine what the game looks like and what keywords come to your mind when you think about it. So it can be like Western, fantasy, dark forest, anything that will trigger some images in your head. And for VR specifically, what I notice look good is any dark environments, but that looks sleek and stylish, anything glowy. And when it's in VR, it feels very futuristic and expensive looking. Anything mysterious looking with fog or rain or stuff like that, this looks great in VR, much better than on PC. You can also think about some settings that are hot right now, because if you can pull it off, just visuals themselves of your game will attract players. And there's some settings that are very hard to get it wrong. It's usually the winter, so things covered in snow, like gothic-y kind of environments covered in snow. Space is very easy to do. Space as, like a universe and planets and stuff, but spaceships are not. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of assets. Underwater is very easy because you can like blur a lot of stuff out. So these are just some examples of the settings. To kind of elaborate on your setting, you need to do mood boards. And those are very easy to do. You just Google images that have look and feel or color palette of the game you're envisioning. And the mood boards are very important for pitches, because that's how you set the stage for yourself. When you're pitching, you don't have concept art yet or any kind of graphics. You just have your vision, and you only have references on these mood boards. So that's very important to really show what do you mean when you talk about the setting you came up with. An example of like small town mystery type of setting. There's a lot of images from Alan Wake. There's some images from The Shining, the movie. And all that kind of really elaborates what do I mean when I say a small town mystery and how I want the game to look like. This is an example of like a sci-fi setting, a spaceship, lab type of stuff that I mentioned before. This is pretty expensive in production, but still it's easier to pull this off than to pull off some realistic dystopian environment.
Quick question for you, Marianna. But regarding mood boards and the images you pick, is there a danger when you show a mood board, let's say with these super high-end graphics, right? And you as maybe you're small, not you personally, but maybe the people putting this together are a very small team and they won't be able to do this. Is there a danger of confusing the audience, or not confusing, but setting expectations to that audience that you may not be able to deliver just when they look at the mood boards? Or do you explain basically what I just said to the audience when you're presenting?
Usually you show something that you can pull off. And the first example, so this is generic mood board that kind of shows more the palette, and it doesn't really show the style. So there's like images from all over the place. The mood board is not a reference for art style by any means. It's just to show what you're thinking.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And like later when your actual artist will be working on an art style guide, they will also put together some references and create like some art piece by themselves that kind of will set the bar. But usually people are not confused by seeing like high-res images, like expensive looking 3D art or something like that. You just need to deliver your vision and how you imagine it's gonna look like, mostly in the sense of atmosphere.
Yep, makes total sense.
So some VR specifics to figure out initially when you're creating your concept. Number one is game length and the session length. It's the most important thing, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more. But for VR, it's ultimately what everybody are interested in, and they're going to be talking about it on forums, and whoever you talk about this game to, they're going to ask about it and judge your game based on that. It's a little bit ridiculous, but that's how things work this day. You need to think, is the player will be sitting or standing? It's also a question that a lot of publishers ask. Arcades will be interested in it. So it's very important, like physical requirements for this game. Are you sitting or standing? How much space do you need to move around? What kind of locomotion it is? What controls are you using? Is it like very high intensive combat? So you need like a lot of space for that. A lot of people will be asking about this stuff. Another point about the target audience, you need to figure out if it's already a skilled gamer who already had a headset and they will have no problem operating a lot of controls and being quick with reactions with like combat and stuff, or it's a more casual experience where literally anybody can pick up controls and start playing. And for VR these days, there's very, very little amount of those really hardcore players, and there's high demand for casual experience, especially for arcades. So it's also something to think about. And you need to do like real research on that, because this VR gaming audience is very different from traditional one. And the VR in this sense is more of an entertainment than like a competitive high skill game. Another specific, you need to figure out how open is the world. Most likely there'll be a huge environments that will require a lot of processing power. And if the world is too open, it might cause a lot of difficulties. So you would need to figure out how to close it but not show it to player, or how to show them objects in the distance that don't really exist, or things like that. So the best way is just to figure out the illusion, how to show the player that the world is big, but not being big in the actual code. So it's a good thing to create a simple map of the game, having in mind how long is the game, and to have that map handy in your deck. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it later. And the last important question that you need to ask is this game worth putting an effort to put a VR headset on? It seems very obvious and simple, but it is really how you're trying to get the players, because if they are, let's say, at some playtesting event and there's a lot of stands with VR and they see how other people play and they need to look at your game and they need to quickly decide, are they going to stay in the line and go through that whole process just to try it or not?
I think number 7, the last question, is probably one of the most important ones, because I've seen games where I went, like you said, went through the effort of putting on the headset, and when I come out of it, I'm like, I could have played this game as a flat game, and it would have been the same experience.
Yeah, that's a hard truth that what like game developers need to face, because it really needs to be worth it, because it's a lot of trouble for this, age of convenience and things handed to you and, things being very quick. But like to just put your headset on, it's like 1 or 2 minutes. Like, is it worth it?
100% agree.
Now, elaborating a little bit on that game length aspect. And so it's also to the point about making an effort to just play this game. Another important thing is how long is the game? Is it worth it to buy it and then have a headset for it and then play it in a headset? A lot of players on Steam or Reddit or anywhere, they all discuss how long is every single game. They're like, whenever a new game come out, it's the first thing they're going to discuss. And they are very particular about the money value. And for VR, for like $20, they expect a very solid experience. And our Witching Tower game, like for more sophisticated gamer, they can play it in like 4-ish hours. And it was not enough for the players. But they always gonna complain, but it's also something to think about. What is the price point that is actually can justify itself for the developer, but also the players are not going to be too mad about it? Like that 50% of the players will be totally fine with that. And also for VR, developers are lucky because nobody expects 40 hours of gameplay, branching, storyline, or anything like that. It can rather be a shorter, like even 2-3 hour game, but very fun gameplay, and players be okay paying like $20 for it or something. And if it's like endless game, like Beat Saber or something, that's even better. But for more linear games, like adventure ones, there is a time on it, a time cap, and you need to figure out how much content you're going to build, because for Witching Tower, for example, to build 5 hours of the game is 1 year, to build 4 hours a game is 8 months. So it's like just a matter of time and money and balancing out. And the length is very important for story progression, because essentially for more linear adventure games, every 15 to 30 minutes, something needs to happen, some major plot twist or opening a new location or something like that. And the amount of this plot points is very proportional to how long is that game. So this is few thoughts on the gameplay length. And now when we figured out the basics and we can describe the look and feel of the game, we can pretty much set the stage for the pitch deck. To elaborate more on your vision, you need to do research and work with references and find games that are similar to your game and figure out how you're going to make your game stand out and how you communicate the features of your game to the players in the most accessible way. So first thing, when you're doing research, and what we're doing in Daily Magic, we asking the question to ourselves, so like, what impression do we want our game to make? And we're looking how other games are viewed by influencers. Because these days, the influencers, streamers, YouTubers, anybody like content creators are the most important people. Like, because actual players, they don't read gaming magazines anymore or anything like that. They watch YouTube, they find somebody who they like, it's authority for them, and their opinion is very important. And so when you decided to make a game, you find like 20 similar VR games. This number is a little high, but you can, at least 10, you will start seeing the pattern. And you watching their walkthroughs or let's plays or something, and you see how these YouTubers or streamers explain this game. And usually it's some very simple 3-sentence explanation. And they use something like, oh, it's like a theme park full of dinosaurs, or it's a spooky VR time. Join as he bravely reads the world of scary ghosts. So streamers as influencers, they view the game like regular player. They, of course, way more skilled than a regular player, but they understand that they need to catch people's attention and they need to communicate it in a language that is understandable for anyone. So nobody's going to elaborate on the features of the game or any marketing language. They're just going to say something like, yeah, it's super fun. We're going to kill ghosts in this game. And that's essentially your impression. And that's this tagline that you want these influencers to put there is your initial 3-sentence vision about the game. How to look for game references, how to work with them. So you need to identify few games. I suggest 5 games that is very close to your idea. You need to play each of this game at least for 1 hour, because in 1 hour you usually will see all the features that the game has. You will get a sense of the story and the atmosphere and progression and the pace of the game. And you need to look for reviews from both players and critics and influencers. Sometimes you can even find a sales data. Like we found some sales data through Steam Spy, through some random research documents that are just floating on the internet, and a lot of VR websites will post somebody's sales numbers. So you need to gather all this data together to just see the big picture of what that genre and setting you picked. How is it doing? And the most important are the reviews from players and how many stars the game make. And if you start reading them, and you will at least read 10, 20 reviews for some specific game, you will start seeing the patterns of what that game did right and what it did wrong. And you just need to study it. And if you, for example, want to make Robo Recall, but with you've seen players they want more variety of robots or something, that's what you can include into your pitch. So you can be explaining, oh yeah, our game is like Robo Recall, but there's 120 robots or something like that. You need to find information about how long is the game. Again, this is the most important thing, because players going to compare. And if your game is very similar to some other game, but it's shorter, nobody's going to bother to play it. If you don't have time to completely play the whole game, you always can watch walkthroughs and YouTube videos, streams or whatever, and see some fast runs or stuff like that. And it will give you an idea how the game is structured, what's going on, what's it about, what are the main gameplay features. And for VR specifically, you need to come up with a little spreadsheet and write how each of those reference games handle locomotion and UI, if your references are VR games. Or if they're not VR games, you just kind of need to come up with that, but you still, for UI specifically, it can be different references that not necessarily similar to your game you're envisioning, but you need to do a real research on UI and locomotion in other games, because you cannot go back and make it worse than somebody did. You need to only make it better, because if it's worse, also nobody's gonna want to play it. And after you figure that out, you need to come up with selling points. And selling points, again, they're mostly, they first of all are there for yourself and your team. You need to also sell yourself on making this game, on investing time in it. The most simple way to put these selling points together is to use very simple language, to use numbers and references. So, for example, this game is good for VR because it has this mechanic, but with this feature. YouTubers, influencers will enjoy it because they can be killing ghosts, and it's going to be fun, and it's going to be a lot of sound, and their viewers will enjoy it. And the good exercise is to say, so this game is like that game plus that other game, and this unique features on top of that. This will be the simplest explanation that you can give to anybody. And don't be afraid that you it looks like you're copying somebody. You're not. It's still going to be very different, whatever you decided to do. It's important to say what's the main goal of the game. And it's also a selling point because everybody wants to know why they're doing it and what's the reward. So if you're saving the kingdom, that's great. And that will also be selling it to whoever you're talking to. You need to mention the length of the game. For VR, it is a selling point. And you need to mention the atmosphere and the look and feel of your game. So as I mentioned before, it will trigger the images in people's heads when you're talking to them about your game. The example on the right is from the job simulator, and they are very specific when they're describing their features. And they also make it fun and readable for any kind of player or person who wants to be entertained. Throw a stapler at your boss, throw tomatoes, aggressively chug coffee. So all this language is very understandable for any kind of person. And when they were like pitching it to their team too, it's also something that got people excited because everybody wants to make a game about throwing stapler at your boss. But when you say something like, oh, it's going to be a complicated UI system, blah, 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 people are like, yeah, whatever. So after you're done research, you can determine what's unique about your game in VR and what will be inspiring production and what will come up in players' mind when they play your game and when they hear about it. Story-based or not story-based, any game will have some kind of story or at least backstory because you need to explain to the players what's going on, why are you in this world, and who's doing what anyhow. So how to come up with a story that makes sense? This is a pretty big topic, and like first thing, you need to learn a little bit of basics and learn about the act structure, identify main characters and conflict and plot twist. There's a really good tutorial on the howtocreatevr.com about writing for VR. You can check that out. It elaborates on this point, and there's a lot of useful tips there.
Yeah, and if I can interject real quick, Marianna, it was presented by John Booker, so he actually does a lot of writing for a living, and it covers not just VR gaming, but also training and other kinds of genres for VR. But definitely, like you said, check it out. Just do a quick search for John Booker on my site. That's Bucher. And then you'll see his both podcast and tutorial on that. So cool.
Cool. You also need to try to explain in a very basic language what will be happening in the game if you're explaining it to a non-gamer, and what would be happening in the actual game. So like you start in the creepy house, and then somebody jumps at you, and then you go to the gas station and you meet this character, and then you go to attraction park and you meet a dog and stuff like that. So it's like you're explaining a movie to somebody, but you essentially explain the game. For more of a level-based game, it's a little different, but it still kind of follows that sequence because every game has beginning and end, and there's something happening in between. The good thing for coming up with stories is using some trendy topics, because it can also be a selling point for your game. If it's about, some social justice issues, if it's about robots, space, Westerns, very popular now. And keep in mind that in VR, you're going to be telling a story mostly through the environment and occasional dialogue, but there will be no cutscenes, no text files or anything like that you can find in traditional flat game, because it's very hard for people to read any of that. And you need to really focus on the environments, and if there will be characters, there will be not as nearly as much dialogue in traditional PC games. So what they're saying needs to be really meaningful and unfold the story. The good example of non-story driven VR game, but you still kind of understand everything about that world and the robots and stuff. So they do short video when you just start the game that kind of explains that robots went out of control and stuff. There's a little bit of dialogue with some command or something when you clear the area, and that's how you get rewarded as well. You know that you've done a good job, and it's delivered through the story, so it all makes sense, and it communicates progress to you. And in that game, it's a really, really good example how you're still immersed and there's no like random scores jumping at you without any explanation, but it's all kind of fit together.
And if I can add one more thing to that, it's amazing that that game is, I think, 1.5 or almost 2 years old, because the level of immersion in that game is just, to me, that's the game that I go back most often to play and have fun with.
Yeah, definitely. And it has like such a high quality graphics.
Yeah, and considering that it is almost 2 years old, right? It's amazing what they've done. Yep.
Few more notes on the game progression. So for the adventure linear game, your progression is basically the sequence of very major events. And on my example here, I'm using one of our mobile games, Sender Unknown The Woods. And that is pretty intense text-based adventure with a lot of people involved. And when something major happens to each person, that's a twist in the game. And the game can do a turn there. And time-wise, it happens every 15 or 30 minutes. So player needs to be entertained very frequently, or they get bored and they not going to play anymore. And having in mind that in VR game, your session is also about 15 to 30 minutes. And by session, I mean you can play it and then take a break or go back to the game next day or something. But something significant need to happen within those 15 or 30 minutes, something that will excite the player and they will want to know more. And if it's like more level-based stuff, you just need to think about difficulty and how you're going to increase that difficulty. And it's also some kind of progression, and you need to plan for the length of your game, how strong your enemies can be, or when do you need to add new enemies, so it keeps things exciting. So this is just a very high level recommendation how to come up with a story and game progression and why is it important, and that you need to make a short outline for it. And when you're able to come up with a hooky story, it will be a good selling point for your game. After the shell of your game is envisioned, and by shell I mean look and feel, the story, the initial game progression vision, the main description of the game. So when you came up with that, you need to come up with actual gameplay features, and you need to decide what would be the most fun to do in your VR game. And again, luckily in VR game, it's still very early, so you don't need to create a huge, gigantic UI system or craft system or tons of features. You can come up with only 2 or 3 main mechanics. They'll be super fun to do in VR. And if you describe it with a basic language, it can be like bow and arrow, sword fighting, gun shooting, potato gun shooting, or stuff like that. Right away, I suggest to itemize every enemy or character or whoever is involved in the gameplay, and it will help you later with making tables like this, and I will elaborate on it more. So I suggest right away to decide how many types of enemies, armor, characters, units, or anything involved in the gameplay you're going to have, because later you will need to make all kinds of spreadsheets with that, and your very early prototype will involve this, because that's how you're going to start with the actual production. You're going to put all your units and enemies on a very temporary location and see if the gameplay feels right. All this story stuff, it will come later in the game, because first you're going to be prototyping on mechanics. And coming up with the features, you need to be very clear of if you're doing something that has been done before and it's most of the game mechanics, like how it's going to be different in your game. Or if you coming up with mechanics that already exists in tons of other games, what one VR specific and your game-specific mechanic are you adding? So, for example, in Witching Tower, there's 3 main mechanics. There's puzzle solving, combat with sword and shield, and bow and arrow. And those mechanics are no surprise for anybody. And they are done in many other games, and we're doing them too. But we came up with a lasso mechanic that is very rarely done in other games. And that's what made our game fun and what made it stand out. And at least one mechanic of whatever you choose need to be unique for VR and play way more fun for VR. It also will increase the value of your game and will make players want to put an effort and go through the trouble with headset and buying everything. And one of the mechanics in VR games specifically is always exploration and interacting with the environment. So you need to plan for most of the props or any objects in environment needs to be interactable because people want to touch it, break it, and stuff like that. And there's games that use this as a main mechanics, like that job simulator I mentioned. So it's really fun to do in VR and the most fun to do it in VR than anywhere else. And also VR specific, the mechanics and the actions in the game need to kind of make sense for your actual arms in the real world. And the most fun mechanics are those ones that make sense for you to actually do in the real world. And another point on that, itemization of units and enemies and stuff. So you need to do something like this very early, not on the pitch stage, but very early. And for the pitch, you need to know how many of what you're going to have. So somebody can count really quickly if it's enough content for that length that you're planning and if it's exciting enough. But later you'll be making tables like that where you create a little system and that's how you explain it to your programmer and level designer, how different enemies react to attacks, how much health they have, how can they move, how aggressive they are, and so on. And another thing I want to point out when you think about game features and game mechanics is your initial UI vision. And that's also something you need to come up with very early. For VR, there's a lot of limitations on UI, and because you're not going to have a lot of game features, you don't need a gigantic UI or huge inventory system. It needs to be very minimalistic, essentially nothing on the screen, and you will call something out by pressing a control. In Vision Tower, we use the solution as a little box on your left hand that you can pull stuff out of there. And for armor, we made a belt for the player that they can just hang their armor there. Both solutions are not great, and I suggest to iterate on UI as much as possible. But initially, you need to explain to your team and people you show in this deck to what are the controls and how player operate the game. And you need to do research, play at least 5 games, take screenshots, how they do it, explain how you're going to do it compared to them. And a quick tip, the safest visual style for UI in any game is those minimalistic bluish or green, purple type of stuff that use like simple flat lines and it glows when you do something right. Like anything that is material like metal or wood or anything like that, none of that looks good in VR. They all need to be a little futuristic, even if your game is like medieval fantasy or something. And the scheme of your controls also need to be in your initial deck. And if you're showing it specifically to somebody involved in VR industry, that's also what they want to hear about. So gameplay is the most important in your VR game. And once you figured it out and describe on a very basic level what would be the most fun, what will be happening in the game every 15-30 minutes, and what are the controls, it all comes together. After all the basics are covered in your concept, you need to have a tool set, how you're going to communicate the concept and your vision to your team and how it will transform into actual production plan. So first of all, you're going to need this concept that you came up with, and you're going to show it to your team, make people excited. It needs to be a very clear, elaborative document or pitch deck, just explaining on a high level what is this game. Ideally, you write GDD, game design document, and this is way more complex, 20, 30 page document. Even for a small game, it's going to be that many pages because screenshots, schemes, and stuff like that. Then GDD, if you're lucky, somebody will read it once or twice, and that's it. but you would need it for publishers if you work with somebody. And then what people are going to read maybe 2 or 3 times are the guidelines. For every role on the team, there should be a guideline with the standards, with color palette, with all those mood boards you created to kind of remind people what kind of game is that. And also, of course, the technical side of it, like how many polygons, how many states for each animation, stuff like that. The rules to place enemies for level designers, and all kinds of things. It all needs to be elaborated for each specific role on the team. Even if it's like 2-person team, it still needs to be done. Another good tool is individual technical tasks for every single asset and feature in the game. This ones people are actually going to read, and that's how they're going to create the game assets and code features and do literally anything. And those are most important, and people are going to read them often. And important for also your initial pitch is a map of the game that shows how big the world is and what's in it, and some kind of level structure. And all this can be done in just Google Docs, Google Slides, spreadsheets, and stuff like that, and everybody can access it at any time. And in my experience, the attention span of a mid-sized game studio is about 2.5 days. So every 2.5 days, you need to remind people what kind of game we're working on and bring up that vision once in a while to keep them on track. And just an example, what game map looks like. And this is something, if you're not an artist, you can just do a very basic version of it, but everybody needs to understand from the very beginning how big is the game world and what's included in it, how many environments, if it's like the whole city, or if it's like a one house, or if it's some dungeon. Everybody needs to have that idea in their head right away. And for VR games specifically, it's better to do it in kind of 3D style, because the player's inside the game, and on the basic visual level, you need to get everybody excited that it's going to be really good and epic, huge environments in VR. So that's covering all the basics. And after you figured out all these components and describe them in your pitch deck, you can pitch the game to your team, to publishers, or whoever. For publishers, of course, needs to be a way more fancier version of it, but it's very easy to do, like a more marketing looking pitch when you have your internal pitch done.
Marianna, thank you so much for doing this tutorial. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad I did it. I really hope listeners can find some useful information.
Definitely. Now, if people want to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
They can email me at marianna@dailymagic.info, or go to our Daily Magic Productions Facebook page, or they can find me on LinkedIn, Marianna Vallejo.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Marianna, and to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with us. Just a quick reminder, if you want to access all of our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more, register for free at howtocreatevr.com. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltspaceVR and subscribe to our channel. Until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.